The golden light filtering through the cathedral's stained glass should have been beautiful. Instead, it felt like a spotlight reserved for public executions. Annie Audrey stood frozen at the altar in her mother's vintage lace gown, a gown that now felt less like a promise and more like a burial shroud. The dress was too tight, or maybe her lungs had simply forgotten how to work. To her right, where Mark should have been standing, there was nothing, just empty space and the wilting white roses marking a groom who would never arrive. The murmurs started in the back pews, a low hum that grew into something uglier with each passing second. Where is he? Oh my God, did he really? That poor girl. Annie's vision blurred at the edges. She couldn't tell if it was tears or the beginning of something worse, a full collapse, maybe, right here on the altar steps. Her heart slammed against her ribcage so violently she wondered if the guests in the front row could see it trying to escape. Every second Mark didn't walk through those doors was another piece of her dignity crumbling to dust. The side entrance groaned open. Annie's head snapped toward the sound. Hope flaring hot and desperate in her chest, he came back. He changed his mind. This nightmare is over, but the hope died before it could even draw breath. It wasn't Mark. It was his best man, Thomas, looking like he'd just crawled out of a grave. His face was gray, his shirt collar soaked with sweat despite the cool cathedral air. He wouldn't look at her. He approached the altar like a man approaching a guillotine. And when he reached her, he shoved something into her hand, crumpled notebook paper, torn at the edges, then backed away as if she'd just been diagnosed with something contagious. Annie's fingers shook as she unfolded the note. The handwriting was Mark's, but it was rushed, panicked, the letters bleeding into each other. Annie, I can't do this. I owe money to people you don't want to know about. If I stay, they'll kill me. I'm already on a plane, don't try to find me. You're better off forgetting I existed. The bouquet of white peonies slipped from her hands. It hit the marble with a muffled, pathetic sound, petals scattering like shrapnel. She wasn't just abandoned. As the words, people you don't want to know about, burned into her brain, a horrifying clarity settled over her. Mark hadn't just left her at the altar. He'd left her holding the bill for a debt she didn't know existed. To people she couldn't name, to consequences she couldn't outrun. Annie Audrey wasn't jilted. She was collateral. The whispers in the cathedral swelled into something crueler now. Pity, mixed with scandal. She must have known. How could she not? What kind of man leaves a woman like that? The words clawed at her, but Annie couldn't move. Her legs had stopped taking orders from her brain. She stood there, a statue in lace, drowning in golden light and the wreckage of a future that had just evaporated. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the cathedral exploded open. Not a polite creak, not a hesitant push. They slammed against the stone walls with a sound like thunder, and every head in the church whipped around in unison. The whispers died instantly, choked off mid-syllable, replaced by a silence so absolute it felt like the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Annie turned and saw him. Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Before we find out whether Annie takes Damian's hand or risks everything to walk away, I want to know, where are you watching from right now, and what time is it there? Let me know in the comments below. And please hit that like button and subscribe to join our community. Trust me, you won't want to miss what happens next. The moment Damian Cepeda stepped through those cathedral doors, the entire world seemed to tilt on its axis. Annie felt it before she saw him, a shift in the air, a drop in temperature, the kind of primal warning that made prey animals freeze in the forest. The whispers that had been dissecting her humiliation died mid-sentence, replaced by a silence so complete she could hear her own heartbeat thundering in her ears. She turned, still clutching Mark's cowardly note in one trembling hand, and watched as a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a nightmare or a fever dream strode down the center aisle with the unhurried confidence of someone who owned not just the room, but every soul in it. The maroon suit was the first thing that branded itself into her consciousness. It was the color of Cabernet wine, of crushed velvet curtains in old theaters, of blood that had dried on expensive fabric. The tailoring was immaculate, cut so precisely to his frame that it seemed less like clothing and more like armor. The jacket hugged his broad shoulders and tapered at his waist, and beneath it, a crisp white dress shirt stretched across a chest that suggested he was no stranger to violence. A burgundy tie, perfectly knotted, sat against the white like a declaration, but it was what rose above the collar that made Annie's breath catch in her throat. Tattoos, dark, intricate ink crawled up both sides of his neck like living art, disappearing beneath his jawline and emerging again just behind his ears. From where she stood, she could make out thorned roses, their petals rendered in exquisite detail, a cross that sat at the hollow of his throat, and text in elegant script that she couldn't read but felt in her bones was either a prayer or a promise of damnation. The ink was bold, unapologetic, a stark contrast against his olive skin. This was not a man who hid what he was. His face was carved from stone, all sharp angles and brutal symmetry. A strong jaw, high cheekbones that could cut glass. A nose that had been broken at least once and healed slightly crooked, which somehow made him more dangerous rather than less. His lips were full but pressed into a hard line, and his eyes, God. His eyes were the darkest brown she'd ever seen, so deep they looked black in the cathedral's golden light. Those eyes swept the crowd once, and grown men shrank back into the pews. His hair was dark and slicked back with precision, not a strand out of place, the style severe and controlled. On his left hand, which he kept casually at his side, she caught the glint of silver rings on 3 fingers, heavy and ornate. On his right wrist, a watch that probably cost more than her entire wedding budget gleamed under the stained glass light. He walked like a predator. Each step was measured, deliberate, the polished leather of his shoes clicking against the marble floor in a rhythm that sounded like a countdown. He didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every person in that cathedral knew exactly who had just entered, and more importantly, what he was capable of. Annie heard the name before she understood it. An elderly woman 3 rows back gasped and clutched her rosary, whispering to her husband in Spanish, "Es Damián Cepeda. Dios mío, es el Cepeda." The man beside her went white and made the sign of the cross. Another guest, a younger man in an ill-fitting suit, stood up as if to leave, then thought better of it and sat back down, his hands shaking. Damián Cepeda. The name hung in the air like a curse. Annie didn't know who that was, but she knew enough to be terrified. This was not a man who attended weddings out of social obligation. This was not a man who did anything without purpose. He reached the altar and stopped. 3 feet from her, close enough that she could smell him, an intoxicating, dangerous mixture of expensive cologne, leather, and something darker. Smoke, maybe. Gunpowder. The scent of a man who lived in shadows and emerged only when blood needed to be spilled. For a long moment, he said nothing. He simply looked at her, his gaze moving from her tear-stained face down to the scattered bouquet at her feet, then back up again. There was no kindness in those eyes. No pity. Only assessment. As if he were calculating her worth the way someone might appraise a piece of property. The priest, Father Dominic, who'd known Annie since she was a child, took a trembling step forward. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but this is a house of God, and..." Damián's head turned slowly toward the old man. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Sit down." 2 words. That was all it took. Father Dominic's mouth snapped shut, and he backed away from the altar as if he'd been physically pushed, his face the color of chalk. Damián returned his attention to Annie, and when he spoke again, his voice carried through the cathedral like a judge delivering a verdict. "Mark Delgado is gone. He left the country approximately 90 minutes ago on a one-way ticket to Buenos Aires under a fake name." He paused, letting that sink in. "He will not be coming back. Not for you. Not for anyone." Annie's knees threatened to buckle. 90 minutes. Mark had been gone for 90 minutes, and she'd been standing here like a fool, waiting for him. "He owes me money," Damián continued, his tone conversational now, almost pleasant, which somehow made it worse. Quite a lot of it, actually. $300,000, to be precise. He borrowed from my organization 6 months ago, claiming he needed capital for a business venture. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. The venture was a poker habit and a mistress in Miami. The money is gone, and so is he. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Annie felt the note crumple further in her fist. A mistress. Of course there was a mistress. Of course Mark's cowardice ran deeper than she'd even imagined. "When a man borrows from me," Damián said, his eyes never leaving Annie's face, "he signs a contract." Mark understood the terms. If he couldn't repay the debt, I would take collateral. He offered his business, his car, his watch. Damián waved a dismissive hand. "Worthless things." Then he offered something more interesting. He took a single step closer. "He offered you." The world spun. Annie opened her mouth to speak, to scream, to do something, but nothing came out. "He said," Damián continued, his voice dropping lower, more intimate, as if they were the only 2 people in the room, "that you were the most valuable thing he possessed, that you were worth more than any asset he could liquidate. He signed a contract stating that if he defaulted on his debt, I could claim you as payment." He tilted his head slightly, studying her, and here we are. Somewhere in the back of the church, a woman started crying. Another guest whispered urgently to someone beside him. No one moved to leave. No one dared. Annie finally found her voice, though it came out strangled and raw. You can't. People aren't property. You can't just tell that to your fiancé. Damian interrupted smoothly. He's the one who treated you like an asset. I'm simply here to collect what was promised to me. He reached into his jacket pocket. Several guests flinched and pulled out a folded piece of paper. He opened it with one hand, the movement casual, and held it up so she could see. Even from where she stood, she recognized Mark's signature at the bottom. Legally binding. Witnessed. Notarized. Her vision blurred. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. Damian folded the contract and slipped it back into his pocket. Then he looked at her with something that might have been sympathy on a different man, but on him looked like cold calculation. Mark Delgado was a coward and a thief. He stole from me, and he stole your dignity. But here's the truth, Annie Audrey. Her name in his mouth sounded possessive. Claimed, you are the only thing of value he left behind. The cathedral had never felt so small. Annie stood frozen, a deer caught in headlights that were about to run her down, while Damian Cepeda waited with the patience of a man who knew the outcome before the game had even begun. The crumpled note from Mark felt like hot coals in her palm. You can't be serious, she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. This is insane. I'm not something you can just collect like a debt. Damian's expression didn't change, but something flickered in those dark eyes. Not anger, something closer to amusement. You think I want to be here? He gestured around the cathedral with one ring-laden hand. I have better things to do on a Tuesday afternoon than crash a wedding that was already a disaster before I walked through those doors. He took another step closer. Close enough now that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. Up close, she could see the fine details of the ink on his neck. The thorns on the roses were so realistic, she half expected them to draw blood. A single word in script ran along his jawline. Venganza. Revenge. But here's what you need to understand, Annie Audrey. Her name again, spoken like a claim already staked. Mark didn't just steal from me. He stole from very bad people and then told those very bad people that I was protecting him, that I had vouched for him. His voice dropped lower, more dangerous. Do you know what happens when a man like me appears to protect a thief? It makes me look weak. And when men in my position look weak, other men try to take what's ours. Annie's heart hammered against her ribs. I don't understand what that has to do with me. Everything, he said it simply, as if explaining basic arithmetic to a child. Mark ran, but his debts don't run with him. They stay here, with you. The men he owes, men far less civilized than I am. They know he had a fiancé. They know you exist. And they will come looking for you to draw him out, or simply to send him a message about what happens when you steal and run. The blood drained from Annie's face. She looked past Damian to the sea of faces in the pews, her mother, her sister, her friends, all watching with varying degrees of horror and morbid fascination. They couldn't help her. No one could. You're trying to scare me, she said, but her voice shook. I'm trying to save your life. He said it without emotion, a simple statement of fact. Mark painted a target on your back the moment he decided to use my name as a shield while robbing from the Cortez family. Do you know who they are? She shook her head. Good. You shouldn't. But they know who you are now. They have your address, your workplace, your sister's apartment number where you've been staying since you moved out of Mark's place last month. He paused, letting that sink in. They are not patient men. They are not forgiving men. And they are certainly not men who care that you had nothing to do with your fiancé's stupidity. Annie felt the room tilt. How do you know where I've been staying? Because I've had people watching you since the moment Mark signed that contract 3 weeks ago. Damian said it without a hint of apology. I protect my investments. And whether you like it or not, you became my investment the moment Mark put your name on that paper. This is kidnapping, she breathed. This is survival. He cut her off, his voice sharp now, the velvet glove coming off to reveal the iron fist beneath. You have 2 choices. And neither of them involves going back to your normal life because that life ended the second Mark got on that plane. He held up one finger. Choice 1. You walk out of this cathedral right now. Alone. You go back to your apartment, or your sister's place, or wherever you think you can hide. You spend the next few weeks, maybe days, looking over your shoulder, waiting for men with no conscience to kick down your door and use you as a message board to write threats they'll carve into your skin. Annie felt bile rise in her throat. Damian held up a second finger. Choice 2. You marry me. Right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. You become Annie Cepeda, and the moment you take my name, you become untouchable. No one in this city, no one in this country will dare lay a hand on you, because everyone will know that touching you means going to war with me." He leaned in, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "And trust me, Querida, no one wants that war." The silence that followed was deafening. Annie could hear her own pulse thundering in her ears, could feel the weight of every eye in the cathedral pressing down on her. Her mother was crying in the third row, clutching her rosary. Her sister looked ready to vault over the pew and tackle Damian herself. "You're insane," Annie whispered. "I'm practical." He straightened, adjusting one of his rings with casual precision. "I need to clean up the mess Mark made. Having you as my wife does that. It sends a message that I've taken responsibility for his debts, that you're under my protection, that the matter is settled. It makes me look strong instead of weak, and it keeps you alive. And what do you get out of this?" Her voice was stronger now, anger beginning to override terror. "Besides using me as some kind of twisted PR move," something almost like respect flickered across Damian's face. "I get a wife who isn't afraid to ask the hard questions. That's more than most men in my position can say." He glanced at his watch, a casual gesture that somehow felt threatening. "But we're running out of time. The Cortez family knows Mark is gone by now. They'll be looking for leverage. You have 60 seconds to decide which choice you can live with." He gestured to the priest, who looked like he might faint. "Father Dominic has very kindly agreed to proceed with the ceremony. Same dress, same flowers, same vows, just a different groom." His lips curved into something that might have been a smile on a different man. "One who actually shows up." Annie looked down at the scattered peonies at her feet, at Mark's cowardly note still crumpled in her hand, at the future she'd planned that had evaporated like morning mist. Then she looked back at Damian Cepeda, this beautiful, terrifying man in his blood-red suit, with his neck full of ink and his eyes full of secrets and his hands that she knew, somehow, were capable of both protection and destruction. If you can't stand cowards like Mark who leave women to clean up their mess, hit that subscribe button. Only toxic manipulators and cowards will skip this. Show us you stand for loyalty. If I say yes, Annie heard herself say, her voice surprisingly steady. What happens to Mark? Damian's smile widened, and for the first time, it reached his eyes. That's the first smart question you've asked. He offered her his hand, palm up, an invitation and a threat all at once. Say yes, and I'll tell you everything. Annie Audrey looked at that outstretched hand, scarred knuckles, heavy silver rings, a lifeline that led into darkness, and realized she'd already made her choice the moment she'd read Mark's note. She was collateral either way. At least this way, she'd be collateral with teeth. She placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers, warm and solid and utterly unbreakable. I do, she whispered. Damian Cepeda smiled like the devil who'd just won another soul. Good girl. Father Dominic's hands shook so violently that the prayer book slipped from his grasp twice before he managed to hold it steady. The old priest had baptized Annie, had given her first communion, had heard her confessions about stolen cookies and white lies. Now he stood before her, his face the color of old parchment, and prepared to marry her to a man whose very name made grown men cross themselves. Dearly beloved, Father Dominic began, his voice cracking on the second word. He cleared his throat, tried again. We are gathered here today. Skip to the vows. Damian's voice cut through the traditional ceremony like a blade through silk. He hadn't let go of Annie's hand since she'd placed it in his grip firm and possessive, his thumb tracing absent circles on her wrist that should have been comforting but felt more like a brand being slowly burned into her skin. Father Dominic's mouth opened and closed. But the readings? Father. Damian turned his head slowly toward the priest, and whatever the old man saw in those dark eyes made him snap the prayer book shut with trembling fingers. Of course, yes, the vows. He looked at Annie with something that might have been an apology or a plea for forgiveness. She couldn't tell which. Do you, Annie Audrey Madeline Carmichael, take this man? Damian Alejandro Cepeda, Damian supplied, his voice rich with dark amusement. To be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part. The words hung in the air like a noose. Annie felt the weight of them, the permanence, the terrible finality. She looked up at Damian, at this stranger who held her life in his scarred hands, and tried to find something, anything that wasn't pure terror in the moment. His eyes were steady on hers, unreadable, waiting. Behind her, she heard her mother sob. Her sister hissed something that sounded like, "Annie." No, but the words seemed to come from very far away, like she was hearing them underwater. Mark's note was still crumpled in her other hand. "I'm already on a plane. Don't try to find me." "I do." The words came out as barely more than a whisper, but they might as well have been shouted from the cathedral's bell tower. The weight of them crashed down on her shoulders the moment they left her lips. Tears spilled hot and fast down her cheeks, destroying what was left of the makeup her sister had so carefully applied just hours ago, back when Annie had still believed in fairy tales. Father Dominic turned to Damian with visible reluctance, as if hoping the man might spontaneously combust before the next question had to be asked. "And do you, Damian Alejandro Cepeda, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife, to have and to hold, from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death do you part?" Damian's response was immediate, his voice clear and strong enough to carry to the very back pew. "I do." No hesitation. No doubt. He said it the way other men might swear an oath of loyalty or declare war. An absolute statement of fact. He released her hand only long enough to reach into his jacket pocket. For one brief, insane moment, Annie thought he might pull out a gun. Instead, his fingers emerged with a small black velvet box that looked ancient, the kind of thing that had been passed down through generations or stolen from a museum. He opened it with one hand, and Annie's breath caught in her throat. The ring inside was obscene, a massive emerald deep green, the color of old money and older secrets sat in the center, surrounded by a halo of diamonds that caught the cathedral's light and threw it back in aggressive sparkles. The band was platinum, intricate filigree work that looked handcrafted by someone who understood that beauty and danger could exist in the same breath. "This belonged to my grandmother," Damian said quietly, and for just a moment, something almost human flickered across his face. "She wore it for 63 years. Until the day she died, she never took it off." He looked at Annie, and the humanity vanished, replaced by that same calculating intensity. "Neither will you." Before she could respond, he slid the ring onto her finger. It was heavy, God. It was so heavy, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her hand, as if he'd known all along that this moment would come. "The ring," Father Dominic squeaked, looking at Damian. "I don't need one." Damian's tone made it clear the subject wasn't up for discussion. The priest swallowed hard and raised one shaking hand in a gesture that was probably meant to be a blessing but looked more like a warding sign. "Then by the power vested in me by God and the state of California, I now pronounce you man and wife." He said it quickly, as if speed might somehow make it less real. "You may kiss the—" Damian didn't wait for permission. His hand came up to cup the back of Annie's head, fingers threading through her carefully pinned hair and destroying the elegant updo in one deliberate motion. Before she could draw breath to protest, he pulled her against him and claimed her mouth with a kiss that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with ownership. It wasn't gentle. It wasn't sweet. It was a statement written in heat and pressure, and the faint taste of whiskey on his lips. His other hand found the small of her back, pressing her body flush against his. And Annie felt every hard line of him, the muscle, the controlled power, the barely leashed violence that lived just beneath the expensive suit. She made a sound protest or surrender. She couldn't tell, and he swallowed it, his mouth moving over hers with practiced skill and ruthless precision. This was a man who took what he wanted and made no apologies for it. This was a man who understood that possession was 9/10 of the law and intended to demonstrate that principle thoroughly. When he finally pulled back, Annie's lips were swollen and her lungs were screaming for air. Her hands had somehow ended up fisted in his jacket, crumpling the perfect tailoring. His eyes were darker than before, if that was possible, and there was something satisfied in his expression, like a general who'd just won a critical battle. "Mine," he said quietly, but the word carried through the silent cathedral like a benediction or a curse. He brushed his thumb across her bottom lip, wiping away lipstick that had smeared during the kiss. "Say it." Annie's brain felt like it had short-circuited. "What?" "Say you're mine." His hand was still tangled in her hair, his body still pressed against hers in a way that left no question about who was in control. "Everyone in this church needs to hear it. Everyone in this city needs to know it. Say it." She should have refused, should have shoved him away, should have run screaming down the aisle, should have done anything except look into those bottomless dark eyes and feel something inside her shift and resettle into a shape she didn't recognize. "I'm yours," she whispered. The smile that crossed Damian's face was devastating, beautiful, and terrible all at once. like watching a storm roll in across the ocean. He released her only to take her hand again, lacing his fingers through hers, the massive emerald ring catching the light and throwing green fire across the marble floor. He turned to face the congregation, and Annie turned with him, her legs somehow still functioning despite the fact that her entire world had just been demolished and rebuilt in the span of 15 minutes. "Ladies and gentlemen," Damian announced, his voice carrying the same authority he'd used to silence the priest. "I present to you Mrs. Annie Cepeda." He raised their joined hands, displaying the ring, making sure every person in every pew could see the claim he'd just staked. "Any man who harms her answers to me. Any woman who disrespects her answers to me. Any soul in this city who even looks at her wrong will learn exactly why my family has held power in this city for 4 generations. It wasn't a wedding announcement. It was a declaration of war on anyone stupid enough to challenge him. The congregation sat in stunned silence. No one clapped. No one threw rice. No one moved at all except for Annie's mother, who had her face buried in her hands, and her sister, whose expression promised that there would be a reckoning later, assuming any of them survived whatever came next. Damian tugged Annie's hand gently, pulling her toward the side exit. "Come, Mrs. Cepeda. We have much to discuss, and this place smells like fear and regret." He glanced back at Father Dominic one last time. "Thank you for your service, Father. Your discretion will be rewarded." It wasn't a request. It was an instruction. As Damian led her down the steps and toward the side door, Annie caught one last glimpse of the scattered peonies on the altar. The abandoned bouquet from a wedding that was supposed to be different, supposed to be safe, supposed to be hers. Instead, she wore an emerald the size of a small country and lipstick smeared by a man whose kiss tasted like smoke and danger. And something she couldn't name but knew, with terrible certainty, she would never be able to forget. The heavy door closed behind them with a sound like a tomb sealing shut. Annie Audrey Carmichael was dead. Long live Annie Cepeda. The car waiting outside the cathedral wasn't a car at all, it was a statement. A black Mercedes S-Class with windows so deeply tinted they looked like sheets of obsidian. 2 men in matching dark suits flanked the vehicle, their faces blank, their postures military precise. Neither of them looked at Annie directly, but she felt their assessment nonetheless, felt herself being catalogued and memorized and filed away under protect at all costs, or possibly valuable cargo. Damian's hand remained at the small of her back as he guided her toward the open rear door. His touch was light but unyielding, the kind of pressure that suggested he could be gentle right up until the moment he needed to be something else entirely. "After you, Mrs. Cepeda." The name sent a fresh wave of unreality crashing through her. Mrs. Cepeda. She was married, to a man she'd met 20 minutes ago. A man whose last name apparently functioned as both a shield and a weapon in equal measure. Annie slid into the back seat, the leather cool and butter-soft beneath her, the wedding dress, her mother's dress bunched awkwardly around her legs, the vintage lace suddenly feeling less like an heirloom and more like a costume from a play she hadn't auditioned for. Damian followed her in, settling beside her with the easy grace of someone who'd been sitting in the back of luxury vehicles since birth. The door closed with a solid thunk that sounded disturbingly final. The driver pulled away from the cathedral before Annie could catch her breath. She twisted in her seat, watching through the rear window as the building and everything she'd known grew smaller and smaller until it disappeared around a corner entirely. "Where are we going?" Her voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Small, lost, home. Damian pulled out his phone, his thumbs moving across the screen with practiced efficiency. "Your things from your sister's apartment are already being collected. They'll be waiting for you when we arrive." Annie's head snapped toward him. "You can't just my sister. Your sister has been compensated for the inconvenience and has been instructed not to contact you for the next 72 hours. He said it without looking up from his phone, as if he were discussing the weather rather than her entire life. "After that, we'll arrange supervised visits. But not yet. Not until I'm certain the Cortez family understands that you're no longer a target. You had no right. I had every right." Now he did look up, and the intensity in those dark eyes stole whatever argument she'd been forming right out of her mouth. "You became my responsibility the moment you said, 'I do.' That means I decide who gets access to you, when they get it, and under what circumstances. Your sister's apartment is the first place anyone looking for you would check. Having you anywhere near it would be suicide." The casual way he said suicide made Annie's stomach turn. "You're talking about my family like they're liabilities." He finished her sentence with brutal efficiency. "Until further notice, that's exactly what they are. Anyone who knows you, anyone who loves you, Anyone who might be used as leverage against you is a potential weapon in someone else's hands. He returned his attention to his phone. I'm trying to keep you alive, Annie. Try not to fight me on the basics. She wanted to scream. Wanted to claw at the door handle and throw herself out of the moving vehicle. Wanted to do anything except sit here in her ruined dress and her dead mother's lace while a stranger rewrote the rules of her existence. Instead, she turned to stare out the window. Watching the city slide past in a blur of traffic and Tuesday afternoon normalcy, people walking dogs, couples holding hands, a woman laughing into her phone outside a coffee shop, normal lives. Lives that didn't include forced marriages and death threats and emerald rings that weighed more than reason. The drive took 20 minutes, but it felt like 20 hours. They left the familiar streets of downtown behind, winding up into the hills where the houses grew larger, and the gates grew taller, and the space between properties stretched into acres rather than feet. When they finally turned into a driveway, Annie's breath caught in her throat. She'd expected what? A fortress? A compound with armed guards and razor wire? Something out of a crime movie, all concrete bunkers and security cameras and the aesthetic of a man who lived by violence. What she got instead was a palace. The gate alone was a work of art, wrought iron worked into elaborate patterns of roses and thorns, the metal black as midnight and at least 15 feet high. Beyond it, a long driveway curved through manicured grounds that could have been featured in Architectural Digest. Ancient oak trees lined the drive, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the afternoon sunlight into something golden and almost ethereal. Gardens sprawled in geometric perfection, roses in full bloom, beds of lavender and jasmine that she could smell even through the closed car windows, fountains that caught the light and turned it to diamonds. The house itself rose at the end of the drive like something from another era. Spanish colonial revival, all white stucco and terracotta tile, with arched windows and wrought iron balconies, and a bell tower that reached toward the sky like a church spire. It was massive, easily 10,000 square feet. Maybe more, but somehow it didn't feel ostentatious. It felt old, established, like it had been standing here for 100 years and would stand for 100 more, outlasting empires and men and their small, brutal wars. This is where you live? Annie heard herself ask. This is where we live. Damian corrected her gently, pocketing his phone as the car rolled to a stop in front of a fountain featuring a stone angel with its wings spread wide. Welcome home, Mrs. Cepeda. The driver opened Annie's door, and she stepped out onto cobblestones that were probably older than her grandmother. The air smelled like jasmine and roses and old money. Somewhere nearby, she could hear the sound of water flowing, birds singing, the distant hum of the city far below. It was beautiful. It was terrifying. Damian came around the car and offered his arm like a gentleman from a period drama. When she hesitated, his expression didn't change, but something in his eyes hardened. You can walk in on your own, or I can carry you. Your choice. But we're not standing out here where anyone with a decent rifle scope could turn this into your last photo opportunity. Annie took his arm. He led her up the wide stone steps to a pair of double doors that looked like they'd been salvaged from a cathedral, heavy dark wood carved with religious scenes, saints and sinners forever frozen in their moment of judgment. The doors swung open before Damian could reach for them, and a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and the posture of a drill sergeant stood waiting. Mrs. Rosa, Damian said by way of greeting. This is Annie. She'll be staying in the East Wing. Make sure she has everything she needs. The woman's eyes moved over Annie with the same assessing quality the guards had used, but warmer somehow, almost maternal. Of course, Mr. Cepeda. Welcome, Mrs. Annie. I've been with this family for 34 years. If you need anything at all, you just let me know. Annie opened her mouth to say thank you, but Damian was already moving, pulling her gently but firmly into the house's interior. And God, the interior. Marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A grand staircase that curved upward like something from a fairy tale. Ceilings that soared 20 feet overhead, decorated with exposed wooden beams and iron chandeliers that dripped with crystals. Art on the walls, real art. Museum-quality pieces that Annie's trained eye recognized even through her shock. A Frida Kahlo. A Diego Rivera. Pieces that shouldn't exist in private hands but apparently did in Damian's. How? She started. My grandfather was a collector, Damian said, following her gaze. My father expanded the collection. I've added a few pieces myself. He guided her past the staircase, down a hallway lined with more art and more windows and more evidence of wealth that shouldn't be possible for someone his age. The house has 23 rooms, 7 bathrooms, a library, a wine cellar, a gym, an indoor pool, and grounds that cover 5 acres. You're free to go anywhere you like." Annie stopped walking. "Anywhere?" "Anywhere on the property." He turned to face her fully, and the weight of his gaze was suffocating. "Let me be very clear about the rules, Annie, because I will only explain them once. You are free to do anything you want within these walls. Paint, read, swim, sleep until noon, scream at the sky, I don't care. You want art supplies? They'll be here by morning. You want a piano? I'll have one delivered. You want Mrs. Rosa to make you breakfast at 3 in the morning? She'll do it with a smile." He took a step closer, and Annie's back hit the wall behind her. She hadn't even realized she'd been backing away. "But," Damian continued, his voice dropping lower, more dangerous, "you do not leave this property without me. You do not go into the city without me. You do not step 1 foot past that gate without me at your side, and ideally, at least 2 of my men as well. If you try, I will find you, and I will bring you back, and you will not enjoy the conversation that follows. Do you understand?" Annie's heart hammered against her ribs. "You're keeping me prisoner." "I'm keeping you alive." He reached up and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture almost tender if not for the steel beneath it. "There's a difference. A prisoner has no choices. You have every choice in the world except the one that gets you killed. For how long? Until the threat is neutralized." He said it like it was simple, like neutralizing threats was something that happened on a schedule, like trash pickup or mail delivery. Could be weeks, could be months, but however long it takes, you will be here, and you will be safe, and you will learn to live with the fact that your freedom costs less than your life. Annie felt tears threatening again, hot and furious behind her eyes. "I didn't ask for any of this." "No," Damian agreed, something almost like sympathy flickering across his features. "You didn't. But Mark put you here, and I'm the only thing standing between you and men who would do things to you that would make you beg for death." He stepped back, giving her space to breathe. "So you can hate me if you want. You can curse my name and throw things and make my life difficult. But you will stay alive. That's not negotiable." He turned and started walking again, clearly expecting her to follow. "Mrs. Rosa will show you to your rooms. Dinner is at 8. Dress code is whatever makes you comfortable. I'll be in my study if you need anything." "Wait." Annie pushed off the wall, her legs somehow still functional. "You're just gonna leave me here? In this massive house? With strangers?" Damian glanced back over his shoulder, and for the first time since she'd met him, something that might have been actual amusement touched his eyes. "You'd prefer I stay and help you out of that dress?" Heat flooded Annie's face. "No, Then trust Mrs. Rosa. She raised me after my mother died. If anyone in this house is safe, it's her." He paused, studying Annie's face with that same unsettling intensity. "Get some rest. You've had a long day. Tomorrow we'll talk about the rest of your life." He disappeared around a corner before she could form a response, leaving Annie standing alone in a marble hallway in a palace that was now somehow her prison, her sanctuary, and her home all at once. Mrs. Rosa appeared at her elbow like a ghost. "Come, dear. Let's get you out of that dress and into something more comfortable. You look like you could use some tea and a proper meal. When's the last time you ate?" Annie tried to remember. Breakfast? Had there been breakfast? The day felt like it had lasted 10 years and 10 seconds simultaneously. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Mrs. Rosa made a disapproving sound and took Annie's arm with surprising gentleness. "Well, we'll fix that. Come on. Your rooms are this way." As she let herself be led deeper into the beautiful, terrible house that now bore her name, Annie looked down at the emerald ring on her finger, heavy and green and impossible to ignore. She'd wanted freedom. Instead, she'd gotten a golden cage with marble floors and a man who kissed like he was claiming territory. The worst part? She wasn't entirely sure she wanted to leave. The East Wing was less a bedroom and more a suite that could have housed a small family. A 4-poster bed dominated the space, draped in silk the color of champagne. French doors opened onto a private balcony that overlooked the gardens. There was a sitting area with a velvet sofa, a writing desk positioned to catch the afternoon light, and a bathroom with a clawfoot tub so deep Annie could have drowned in it. Mrs. Rosa had helped her out of the wedding dress, handling the vintage lace with reverent care before hanging it in a closet that already contained more clothes than Annie had owned in her entire life. Designer labels she recognized from magazine spreads. Her size, her style, all waiting like Damian had known exactly who would be wearing them. "Get some rest," Mrs. Rosa had said, patting Annie's hand with maternal firmness. "I'll bring you tea in an hour," but rest was impossible. Annie's mind was a hurricane, spinning through the day's events in a loop that felt increasingly surreal. The abandoned altar, the crumpled note, Damian's entrance, the kiss that had tasted like ownership, the ring that kept catching light and throwing it back in accusations of emerald fire. She changed into one of the dresses from the closet, a simple cotton sundress in pale blue that fit perfectly, because of course it did, and found herself pacing the room like a caged animal, which, she supposed, was exactly what she was. A very well-kept, very expensive caged animal. After 20 minutes of wearing a path in the Persian rug, Annie made a decision. If she was going to be trapped here, she might as well understand the dimensions of her cage. The hallway outside her room was empty. Afternoon light slanted through tall windows, painting everything in shades of gold. She could hear distant sounds, water running somewhere, voices too far away to make out words, the kind of ambient noise that suggested a house that was lived in rather than just displayed. Annie turned left, because it seemed as good a direction as any, and began to explore. The east wing was a maze of rooms that blurred together in their elegance. A music room with a grand piano that looked like it had been played recently, sheet music still open on the stand. A sitting room with walls lined in books, first editions mixed with dog-eared paperbacks in a way that suggested someone actually read them. A sunroom filled with plants that had been tended by someone who understood that living things needed attention to thrive. Each room told a story about the man who lived here, and none of those stories matched the monster she'd been expecting. There was care here, thought, a kind of cultivated beauty that spoke to someone who valued more than just power and fear. She found the locked door at the end of the corridor, past a turn that led away from the main house into what must have been a later addition. The door itself was different from the others, heavier, solid wood instead of the painted panels that marked the rest of the wing. No window, no nameplate, just a door that looked like it was guarding something. Annie tried the handle. Locked. Looking for something? She spun so fast she nearly lost her balance. Damian stood 10 feet away, leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, watching her with that same unreadable expression. He'd changed since they'd arrived, the maroon suit, replaced by dark slacks and a white shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. The casual look should have made him seem less dangerous. Instead, it only drew attention to the ink that covered his forearms, intricate patterns that disappeared beneath the fabric, and left her wondering what other parts of him were decorated with permanent reminders of violence or faith or both. Annie's voice came out defensive. You said I could go anywhere. I did. He pushed off the wall and walked toward her with that predator's grace. Each step measured and deliberate. And I meant it. Including here. He reached past her, close enough that she could smell his cologne, something dark and expensive that made her think of leather and smoke, and produced a key from his pocket. The lock clicked open with a sound that felt significant. Damian pushed the door inward and gestured for her to enter. After you. Annie hesitated, her heart suddenly racing for reasons she couldn't name. There was something in his expression, anticipation, maybe, or the kind of tension that came before a revelation. She stepped past him into the room, and for a moment, her brain couldn't process what she was seeing. Art. The room was filled with art. Not just any art. Her art. Paintings lined the walls in careful arrangement, each one professionally framed and lit with museum-quality fixtures. Annie felt her knees go weak as she recognized piece after piece work she'd created over the past 5 years. Paintings she'd sold through galleries or online platforms to buyers she'd never met. Convergence. She breathed the name of the first painting she saw, an abstract piece she'd done 3 years ago, all blues and grays that suggested storm systems and chaos theory. I sold this to someone in New York. An anonymous buyer through the Caldwell Gallery. That was me. Damian's voice came from behind her, calm and matter-of-fact. Annie moved deeper into the room, her hands shaking as she touched the frame of another painting, Fractured Light. This one had sold at a student exhibition when she was still in art school, before she'd even considered herself a real artist. You couldn't have, this was 7 years ago. I know. He moved to stand beside her, studying the painting like he'd studied it 100 times before. I saw it at the student show. You were standing in the corner, trying to look like you didn't care whether anyone noticed your work. But you kept glancing at it, checking to see if anyone stopped to really look. His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. I bought it that night, paid double what you were asking. Annie's vision blurred. She moved from painting to painting, recognizing each one, remembering the circumstances of each sale. The abstract she'd done during finals week when she couldn't sleep, the landscape from the summer she'd spent in Big Sur, the portrait series that had been her thesis project. 15 paintings in total. Years of work. Years of anonymous sales that had kept her fed and housed and able to keep creating. You've been buying my work for 7 years? Her voice came out strangled. Yes. Why? She spun to face him, and the tears she'd been holding back finally spilled over. Why would you do that? You didn't even know me. Damian stepped closer, and for once, his expression wasn't carefully controlled. There was something raw there, something vulnerable that he usually kept locked behind walls as solid as the ones that protected his house. I saw talent. I saw someone who deserved to be seen. He reached out and wiped a tear from her cheek with his thumb, the gesture surprisingly gentle. Mark wasn't the first person to put your name on a piece of paper that ended up in my hands, Annie. Your gallery registrations, your sales receipts, your artist statements. I've had your name for a long time. The room tilted. You've been watching me for 7 years? Watching is the wrong word. He said it carefully, like he was trying to make her understand something important. I was aware of you. I bought your work because it moved me, because in a life full of violence and compromise, your paintings were something honest, something pure. His jaw tightened. When Mark came to me 3 weeks ago, desperate for money, babbling about his fiancée and his debts, I ran his information, and your name came up. Annie Audrey Carmichael. Artist, former student at Cal Arts, seller of 15 paintings to anonymous buyers. Oh my God. Annie backed away until her shoulders hit the wall between 2 of her paintings. You knew who I was before Mark ever. Before he ever put you up as collateral. Yes. Damian didn't try to follow her, didn't try to minimize it. I could have refused his offer. Should have. Probably. But the moment I realized it was you, he stopped, seemed to struggle with something. I've spent 7 years watching you create beauty from nothing, watching you struggle and survive and refuse to compromise your vision. And then this coward, this fool who didn't deserve to breathe the same air as you, tried to trade you like you were a possession. He moved closer now, slowly, giving her time to tell him to stop. When she didn't, he continued until he was close enough to touch. So yes, I took the deal. Not because I wanted to collect you like I collected your paintings, but because I wanted to make sure no one else could. Annie's breath came in short gasps. That's insane. That's probably, he agreed readily. But it's true. Every painting in this room, I bought because it made me feel something I'd forgotten I could feel. And when I realized the woman who created them was about to be destroyed by a man who couldn't see her worth, his hand came up to cup her face, and his eyes burned with an intensity that should have terrified her but instead made something deep in her chest pull tight. I wasn't going to let that happen. You don't even know me. But the protest came out weak, because he did know her. He knew her through her work, through years of supporting her art when no one else had cared. I know you better than Mark ever did. Damian's thumb traced her cheekbone. I know you paint when you can't sleep. I know you favor cerulean blue when you're happy and titanium white when you're trying to figure something out. I know you spent 6 months working on a single painting about your mother's death. And when you finally finished it, you never tried to sell it because it hurt too much to let go. He paused. That one's not here. I would never ask you to sell something that personal. How did he know about that painting? How did he know any of this? Damian supported her dreams when no one else did. If you believe everyone deserves a partner who lifts them up, comment, I stand for respect below. If you're a hater, just keep scrolling. Annie looked up at him. This beautiful, dangerous man who'd been her anonymous patron for 7 years, who'd essentially bought her from her coward of a fiancé, who'd married her to keep her safe, who'd filled a locked room with her work like it was treasure worth guarding. Why didn't you tell me? She whispered. All this time you could have, because the art wasn't about me. He said it simply. You needed to create on your own terms, without knowing who was watching or what they wanted from you. The moment you knew I was the buyer, everything would have changed. You would have painted for me instead of for yourself. His forehead came to rest against hers, and Annie felt the full weight of his attention, focused entirely on her like a spotlight that could warm or burn depending on how you stood in it. I didn't want to change you. I just wanted to make sure you could keep being exactly who you are. A sob broke free from Annie's chest, grief and confusion and something else, something she didn't have a name for yet. I don't understand any of this. I know. Damian pulled her against him, and she let herself collapse against his chest while his arms came around her and held her steady. You don't have to understand it yet. You just have to trust that I've been keeping you safe long before you knew my name. Annie cried into his shirt while he held her in a room full of her own creations. surrounded by years of proof that someone had seen her, had valued her, had believed she was worth investing in when she'd barely believed it herself. Mark had left her holding nothing but a crumpled note and a mountain of debt. Damian had left her a legacy written in paint and canvas, and the kind of faith that didn't announce itself, that worked in silence and shadows until the moment it was needed most. She didn't know what that meant yet. But as she stood there in his arms, surrounded by her own art, wearing his ring and his name, Annie started to suspect that maybe, just maybe, being collateral to a man who'd spent 7 years supporting her dreams was better than being a bride to a man who'd spent 7 months lying to her face. "Thank you," she whispered against his chest. She felt him smile against her hair. "You earned it. Every painting, every sale, that was your talent, Annie. I just made sure the right person was paying attention." In the locked room full of secrets and art and impossible truths, Annie Cepeda began to understand that maybe her cage wasn't a cage at all. Maybe it was the first real home she'd ever had. Dinner was served in a dining room that could have accommodated 20, but felt oddly intimate with just the two of them seated at opposite ends of a table that stretched between them like a chasm. Crystal glasses caught the candlelight and threw it back in fractured rainbows. Silver cutlery that probably cost more than Annie's old car gleamed against white porcelain plates edged in gold. Mrs. Rosa had outdone herself. Braised short ribs that fell apart at the touch of a fork, roasted vegetables glistening with olive oil and sea salt, fresh bread that still steamed when broken open. The kind of meal that should have been comforting but instead felt like dining in a museum where she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch anything. Annie pushed food around her plate, hyper-aware of Damian watching her from the other end of the table. He'd changed again, a black suit this time, perfectly tailored, with a shirt so white it almost hurt to look at. The jacket fit him like it had been painted on, emphasizing the breadth of his shoulders and the narrow taper of his waist. He ate with the efficiency of someone who viewed food as fuel rather than pleasure, cutting his meat into precise portions, never wasting emotion. Even the way he held his fork spoke of control, of a man who did nothing without purpose. "You need to eat." His voice carried down the length of the table, not unkind but firm. "You've had nothing since breakfast, and even that was probably just coffee." Annie looked up, startled that he'd noticed. "How did you get a line between your eyebrows when you skip meals. Right here." He gestured to the space above his nose. "I've seen it in your artist photos from exhibition openings. You forget to eat when you're nervous." The fact that he'd studied her artist photos, that he'd noticed something that specific, made her stomach flip. She forced herself to take a bite of the short rib. It was delicious. She could barely taste it. "This is ridiculous," she said after swallowing. "We're sitting here like we're in some period drama, miles apart, eating in silence like strangers." Damian set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, studying her with that unreadable expression. Then, without warning, he stood. "You're right." He picked up his plate and wine glass and walked the length of the table, settling into the chair directly beside her instead. "Better?" The sudden proximity was overwhelming. Annie could see the fine details of his face now, the faint scar that cut through his left eyebrow, the shadow of stubble along his jaw, the way his eyes weren't purely black, but actually the deepest brown, almost amber in the candlelight. "I don't know," she admitted quietly. Honest. Something that might have been approval flickered across his features. "I appreciate honesty." He resumed eating, and now she could hear the quiet sounds of silverware against porcelain, could smell his cologne mixing with the scent of rosemary from the vegetables. They ate in silence for several minutes, but it felt different now. Less like dining with a stranger and more like existing in the same space with someone who didn't require constant conversation to fill the quiet. Finally, Damian set down his fork and reached for his wine glass. "You have questions. Ask them." Annie had approximately 700 questions, but one rose to the surface above all the others. The tattoos. What do they mean? He studied her for a long moment, as if deciding how much truth she could handle. Then, slowly, he set down his wine glass and stood. His hands went to his jacket buttons, undoing them with practiced ease before shrugging the expensive garment off and draping it over the back of his chair. Even through the crisp white shirt, Annie could see more ink than she'd realized. The patterns that had been visible on his neck continued down, disappearing beneath the collar, reappearing at his wrists. He unbuttoned his cuffs next, rolling his sleeves up his forearms with deliberate movements. The tattoos were extensive. A full sleeve on his left arm, roses and thorns intertwined with religious iconography, a rosary wrapped around his wrist, a saint she didn't recognize on his inner forearm, eyes turned heavenward in supplication or agony. Text in Spanish winding between the images. La familia es todo. Family is everything. His right arm was different, darker. A skull with a crown of thorns. Dates that might have been births or deaths or both. More text. Justicia para los inocentes. Justice for the innocent. But it was when he unbuttoned the top 3 buttons of his shirt that Annie's breath caught. More ink spread across his chest and up his neck. She could see the edges of something larger, something that must cover most of his torso. And threaded through all of it, visible now in the candlelight, were scars. Thin, white lines that cut through the ink. A puckered mark on his collarbone that could only be a bullet wound. Burns on the inside of his right forearm, old and faded but unmistakable. Every tattoo tells a story, Damian said quietly, holding out his left arm so she could see it better. This one. He touched the saint on his inner forearm. San Judas Tadeo, patron saint of lost causes and desperate situations. My mother had a prayer card with his image. She used to pray to him every night, asking him to protect her children from the life our father had chosen. He turned his arm, revealing a name inked along the inside of his bicep. Maria Rosa Cepeda, 1962 to 2003. She died when I was 19, cancer. We had money by then. My father's business was thriving, but all the money in the world couldn't save her. His jaw tightened. She made me promise, on her deathbed, that I would never become like my father, that I would use the power our family had built to protect people, not prey on them. Annie found herself leaning closer, drawn in despite herself. Damian moved to his right arm, tracing the skull with his finger. This is for my brother Miguel. He was 16 when he was killed in the crossfire of a gang war that had nothing to do with our family. Wrong place, wrong time. The men who killed him walked free because they paid off the right people. Because justice is for sale in this city if you have enough money. His voice didn't change, but Annie heard the rage underneath it, buried so deep it had crystallized into something cold and permanent. So I learned to be the kind of man who makes sure bad men don't walk free, who makes sure that when someone preys on the innocent, there are consequences. He looked at her directly now, and there was no apology in his eyes. I'm not a good man, Annie. I won't pretend to be. I've hurt people. I've killed people. But every person I've hurt was someone who hurt others first. Every person I've killed was someone who would have killed again if I'd let them live. Annie's mouth had gone dry. That's not justice. That's vengeance, Damian supplied. Yes, but it's also protection. The police in this city are bought and sold like merchandise. The justice system is a joke designed to protect people with money and connections. So men like me exist in the spaces where the law won't go. We enforce a different kind of order. He unbuttoned one more button of his shirt, revealing more of his chest. A massive piece dominated the space over his heart, a woman with angel wings, her face tilted upward, tears streaming down her cheeks. The detail was exquisite, every feather rendered in painful precision. My mother, Damian said softly, crying for what her sons became, but watching over us anyway, because that's what mothers do. They love us even when we're monsters. Annie reached out before she could stop herself, her fingers hovering just above the ink. May I? He nodded once. She touched the tattoo, felt the warmth of his skin beneath her fingertips, traced the outline of the angel's wing. His chest rose and fell with steady breaths, but she felt his heartbeat quicken under her palm. Mark used to tell me he was a good man, Annie heard herself say. He'd donate to charity and volunteer at soup kitchens and make a big show of helping old ladies cross the street. But it was all performance, all calculated to make people think well of him. When I found out he'd gambled away money he'd borrowed from friends and family, he cried and apologized and promised to change. But he never did. He just got better at hiding it. She pulled her hand back, meeting Damian's eyes. You don't pretend to be something you're not. You don't lie about what you are. You're terrifying and violent, and you've probably done things that would give me nightmares. But you're honest about it. And somehow that's... She struggled to find the word. Cleaner than Mark's fake virtue. Damian's expression shifted into something she couldn't read. Most people prefer the comfortable lie to the uncomfortable truth. Most people are idiots. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, propelled by 7 years of people telling her that Mark was such a catch, that she should be grateful, that his small cruelties were just quirks she needed to accept. I'd rather know exactly what kind of danger I'm in than have someone smile at me while they're plotting to sell me off to cover their debts. Something like respect flickered in Damian's eyes. He reached for his wine glass, took a slow sip, never breaking eye contact. I hurt bad men, Annie. That's my code. That's what I do. But I have never, and will never, hurt someone who doesn't deserve it. and I will never lie to you about who I am or what I'm capable of." He set the glass down with careful precision. "If that's enough for you, if you can live with being married to a man with blood on his hands, then we might be able to make this work." "And if it's not enough?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. "Then you'll still stay here until you're safe, because I keep my promises. But I won't ask you to share my bed or my life beyond what's necessary for your protection." His voice was steady, but she heard something underneath it. Not hope, exactly, but something close to it. "The choice is yours." Annie looked at this man, this beautiful, brutal man with his ink and his scars and his dark code of honor, and thought about Mark. Mark who'd smiled and lied and sold her like livestock. Mark who'd pretended to love her while planning his escape. Mark who'd left her standing at an altar in her dead mother's dress, holding nothing but a coward's note. Then she looked at Damian, who'd spent 7 years buying her art, who'd married her to keep her safe from consequences she didn't create, who sat here now with his demons visible on his skin, asking nothing from her except the truth about whether she could live with what he was. "I can live with it," she said quietly. The smile that crossed Damian's face was devastating relief and hunger and something deeper all tangled together. "Then we have an understanding, Mrs. Cepeda." He reached for her hand, the one wearing his grandmother's ring, and brought it to his lips. The kiss he pressed to her knuckles was gentle, reverent, completely at odds with everything else about him. "I'm still angry with you," Annie said, even as heat spread through her from the point of contact, "for making decisions about my life without asking me, for keeping secrets, for being so absolutely sure you know what's best for me." "Good." Damian didn't release her hand. "Stay angry. Fight me when I overstep. Push back when I go too far. Just don't lie to me, and don't run from me, and we'll figure out the rest." Annie nodded, not trusting her voice. They finished dinner sitting close enough to touch, with Damian's ink visible and his scars on display, and his truth laid out between them like a table setting. Neither of them had asked for, but both of them would have to learn to navigate. When Mrs. Rosa came to clear the plates, she took one look at them, at Damian's rolled sleeves and unbuttoned collar, at Annie's hand still resting near his on the table, and smiled like she'd just witnessed a miracle. Maybe she had. The scream shattered the pre-dawn silence like a gunshot. Annie jolted awake, her heart already racing before her brain had fully caught up to consciousness. For a moment, she couldn't place where she was, the unfamiliar ceiling, the silk sheets, the enormous bed that wasn't hers. Then reality crashed back. The Cepeda estate. Her third night as a married woman to a man who collected her art and wore his violence like a second skin. Another scream, muffled but definitely female. "Mrs. Rosa." Annie threw off the covers and ran for the door, not bothering with a robe over the oversized t-shirt she'd worn to bed. The hallway was dark except for emergency lighting that cast everything in sickly yellow. She followed the sound of voices, Mrs. Rosa's distressed Spanish, male voices responding in tones meant to calm. She rounded the corner and nearly collided with one of Damian's men. The one she'd learned was called Torres. He caught her by the shoulders, his face grim. "Mrs. Cepeda, you need to go back to your room." "What happened?" I heard. "Back to your room. Now." His tone left no room for argument, but Annie shoved past him anyway, driven by an instinct she didn't fully understand. The front entrance was chaos. Mrs. Rosa stood near the door, being comforted by another housekeeper, her face pale and her hands shaking. 4 of Damian's security team stood in a tight cluster, and in the center of their formation was Damian himself. He'd clearly dressed in a hurry, dark pants, no shoes, a black t-shirt that revealed the full extent of the ink, covering his arms and disappearing beneath the fabric. His hair was disheveled from sleep, but his eyes were wide awake and burning with something that made Annie's breath catch. Rage. Pure, distilled, apocalyptic rage. He was staring at something on the ground just inside the doorway. Annie couldn't see what it was from her angle, but she watched the muscle in his jaw tick, watched his hands curl into fists so tight his knuckles went white. "Damian?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. His head snapped up, and for a moment, she saw something flicker across his face. Concern, maybe, or fear that she was seeing this. Then it was gone, replaced by the cold mask of control she was beginning to recognize as his armor. "Annie, go back upstairs." "What's going on?" "Now." The word cracked like a whip, and several of his men flinched. But Annie had spent 3 days in this house learning the rhythms of it, learning which of Damian's moods were truly dangerous, and which were protective instinct disguised as anger. This was the latter. She could see it in the way his eyes kept darting to her, making sure she was safe, even as his attention remained fixed on whatever lay at his feet. She moved closer, and Torres made a grab for her arm. But she was already past him, pushing between two guards until she could see. The box was small, wooden, the kind that might hold jewelry or keepsakes. It sat innocently on the marble floor, its lid open. Inside, nestled in black velvet, Annie's stomach turned. A dead bird. Its neck twisted at an unnatural angle, its black feathers arranged in a grotesque parody of rest, and pinned to its chest with a silver blade, a photograph. Of her, not a recent photo. This was from years ago, maybe 5 or 6. She was standing outside her old studio apartment, laughing at something off camera, completely unaware she was being photographed. Someone had drawn a red X across her face in what looked disturbingly like blood. And beneath the photo, a message in crude handwriting. "She's next." The world tilted. Annie felt hands catch her Damian's hands, solid and warm, and pulling her away from the box, turning her face into his chest so she wouldn't have to look at it anymore. "Get it out of here." Damian's voice rumbled against her ear, still controlled but with an edge that could cut glass. "Burn it. I want every camera feed from the last 12 hours pulled. I want to know who got within 100 yards of this property. And I want Marco Cortez on the phone in 5 minutes. Boss, maybe we should. 5 minutes." The control cracked just enough to let the rage bleed through, and the room went silent. Annie felt Damian's chest rise and fall beneath her cheek, felt him fighting to pull himself back from whatever edge he was standing on. His arms tightened around her, possessive and protective in equal measure. "Mrs. Rosa," he said, his voice gentler now. "Thank you for alerting us immediately. Take the rest of the day. I'll have Torres drive you to your sister's. But Mr. Damian, I can't just—" "You can and you will. I won't have you here if this escalates." There was no arguing with that tone. "Pack a bag. Torres will wait." Footsteps retreated, doors closed. Within moments, the entrance was empty except for Damian and Annie, and the terrible knowledge of what that box meant. Someone had been close enough to leave a threat on their doorstep. Someone had a photo of her from years ago, which meant they'd been watching her long before Mark, before the wedding, before any of this nightmare had started. Someone wanted her to know she was marked. "How?" Annie's voice came out muffled against Damian's shirt. "You said this place was safe. You said—" "I know what I said." His voice was rough, self-recriminating. "And I meant it, but the Cortez family is more resourced than I anticipated. They must have been planning this for weeks." His hand came up to cradle the back of her head. "I'm sorry. This is my failure. This is Mark's failure." Annie pulled back enough to look up at him. "And whoever sent this, not yours." But Damian wasn't listening. She could see him retreating behind the walls he'd briefly lowered over dinner. Could see him transforming from the man who'd shown her his tattoos and his truth into something harder. Something designed for war. His phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and his expression went glacial. "They're calling," he said quietly. "The Cortez family. They want to talk." The way he said talk made it clear that talking was the last thing that would happen. He looked down at Annie, and for just a moment, the mask cracked. "I need you to go upstairs. Lock your door. Don't open it for anyone except me. Can you do that? Damian, please." The word cost him something. "I need to know you're behind a locked door before I have this conversation. I need to know you're safe so I can do what needs to be done." Annie saw it then, written in the tension of his shoulders and the deadly calm in his eyes. He was about to become the man his tattoos warned people about. The man who hurt bad men to protect good people. The man with blood on his hands and no apologies for it. "Okay," she whispered. He kissed her forehead quick, fierce, claiming and then released her. "Go." Annie went. She made it halfway up the stairs before she heard his voice, cold and precise and absolutely terrifying. "Marco, you made a mistake tonight. A very significant mistake." She should have kept walking, should have locked herself in her room like he'd asked. Instead, she stopped on the landing, hidden in the shadows, and listened. "You think you can threaten what's mine?" Damian's voice carried up the stairwell, each word carefully enunciated. "You think you can leave a dead bird on my doorstep with my wife's picture and walk away from that?" A pause. Someone responding on the other end of the line. "I don't care about your grievances with Mark Delgado. He's gone." The debt was settled the moment Annie became a Cepeda. Another pause, longer this time. "No, Marco, you don't understand. You've made this personal. You've declared war on my family. And now I'm going to show you exactly what that means." The temperature in the house seemed to drop 10 degrees. "By sunrise, I want the name of whoever delivered that box. I want them in front of me, alive and able to talk, and I want you to personally guarantee that no one in your organization will ever look at my wife again." Damian's laugh was empty of humor. "Or what? Or I start with your youngest son. Then I work my way up through your lieutenants, then your businesses, then your properties. And when I'm done dismantling everything you've built over the last 30 years, I'll come for you personally, and I'll make sure you watch as I burn your legacy to the ground." Annie pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound. "You have until sunrise, Marco. I suggest you use the time wisely." The call ended. For a long moment, there was only silence. Then, "I know you're still there, Annie." She froze. "How did he—" "Come down here." It wasn't a request. Annie descended the stairs slowly, her legs shaking. Damian stood in the entrance, his back to her, staring at the spot where the box had been. His shoulders were rigid, his fists still clenched. "I told you to lock your door," he said without turning around. "I needed to know you were okay." "I'm not okay." He turned then, and what she saw in his face made her breath catch. The rage was still there, but beneath it was something raw. "I'm going to hurt people tonight, Annie. Maybe kill them. I'm going to do things that will confirm every dark thought you've ever had about what kind of man I am." He took a step toward her. "And I won't regret it, because they threatened you, and that is the one unforgivable sin." Annie should have been terrified, should have been repulsed. Instead, she found herself walking toward him, closing the distance until she could reach up and touch his face. "I know," she said quietly. "You know what? I know what you are. I know what you're capable of. And I know that every terrible thing you're about to do is because you're trying to keep me safe." She held his gaze, let him see that she wasn't running, wasn't flinching. "So do what you need to do, and then come home." Something in his expression broke. He pulled her against him, burying his face in her hair, and she felt him shake with the effort of holding himself together. "I'm sorry you have to see this side of me," he murmured against her temple. "I'm not." Annie wrapped her arms around him, held on tight. "Because Mark would have run. He would have left me to deal with this alone. But you're standing here, ready to go to war for someone you barely know. That's not something to apologize for." Damian pulled back just enough to look at her, and the gratitude in his eyes was almost painful to witness. "Go lock your door now. Torres will stay outside your room. Don't open it until I come back." "How long?" "As long as it takes." He kissed her once, hard and possessive, a brand and a promise. "But I will come back." Annie nodded and forced herself to turn away, to climb the stairs, to leave him standing there in the entrance where someone had dared to threaten what was his. From her room, she heard cars starting, engines roaring, the sounds of men preparing for violence. She sat on the edge of her bed, still wearing his grandmother's ring, and waited. Damian came back 3 hours before dawn, moving quietly down the hallway. She heard him pause outside her door, heard him test the lock to make sure she'd obeyed. "I'm safe," she called softly. "Are you?" A long pause. Then, "Always. For you, I'm always safe." She heard him walk away, heard the shower start in his room down the hall. The water ran for a long time. When it finally stopped, she imagined him washing away whatever he'd done, whatever blood he'd spilled, becoming clean again before the sunrise. Annie didn't sleep. But she wasn't afraid, because she'd seen the monster in the maroon suit, and she understood now that he only showed his teeth to protect what he loved. And somehow, impossibly, that included her. Annie woke to silence. Not the comfortable silence of a house at rest, but the heavy, oppressive quiet that came after something had shattered. She'd learned to recognize the difference over the past week. The Cepeda estate had its own language, the morning sounds of Mrs. Rosa preparing breakfast, the distant hum of security patrols changing shifts, the occasional ring of Damian's phone conducting business from his study. This silence was wrong. She found him in his office, standing by the window that overlooked the gardens. The morning light painted him in shades of gold and shadow, but there was nothing warm about the way he stood, rigid, distant, like a statue contemplating its own destruction. He'd changed since last night. Gone was the t-shirt stained with whatever he'd done in those dark hours. Now he wore a perfectly pressed white shirt, dark slacks, his hair slicked back with military precision. The armor was back in place, every piece of it. On his desk sat a leather duffel bag that Annie had never seen before. "Damian." She stepped into the room cautiously, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor. "What's going on?" He didn't turn around. "I need you to pack your things. Anything important, documents, jewelry, sentimental items. You have an hour." The words hit her like a physical blow. Pack? Why would I? Because you're leaving. He said it flatly. No emotion, no inflection. Like he was reading from a script he'd memorized but didn't believe. Today, within the hour, Annie's heart started hammering against her ribs. I don't understand. Last night you said, last night I was wrong. He finally turned to face her, and the emptiness in his eyes was worse than any rage she'd seen. I thought I could keep you safe. I thought having you here, under my protection, would be enough. But the Cortez family has resources I underestimated, connections I didn't account for, and after what happened with that box, his jaw tightened. I can't guarantee your safety anymore. Not here, not with me. That's insane. Annie moved closer, trying to read what was beneath the mask. You handled it. You said you took care of the threat. I handled one threat. There will be others. He gestured to the bag on his desk. I've packed everything you'll need. Cash $50,000, all untraceable. A new passport with a clean identity. Documentation for a bank account in your new name with another $100,000 already deposited. And a phone with one number programmed in an associate of mine in Seattle who will help you establish a new life. The room spun. Seattle? Or anywhere else you want to go. The passport is good for international travel. You could go to Europe, Asia, South America, anywhere far from this city, and the people who want to hurt you because of what Mark did. He picked up the bag, held it out to her like an offering or a sentence. The debt is paid, Annie. You're free. Those words, the debt is paid, echoed in the space between them like a death knell. You're lying. Annie heard herself say it, saw Damian's expression flicker for just a moment before the mask slammed back into place. The debt isn't paid. If it was, you wouldn't look like someone just died. My feelings are irrelevant. But his voice cracked on the word feelings, betraying him. What matters is your safety. And the safest place for you is as far from me as possible. Annie stared at this man, this beautiful, broken man who'd bought her art for 7 years, who'd married her to keep her safe, who'd gone to war last night for daring to threaten her and felt something crystallize in her chest. Understanding maybe, or fury, or love disguised as both. What happened last night? She asked quietly. What did you do that's making you send me away? Nothing you need to know about. Tell me anyway. Damian set the bag down with careful precision, and when he looked at her again, there were cracks showing in his armor. I found the man who delivered the box. He was a low-level courier, barely 20 years old, who had no idea what he was carrying, just following orders from his boss in the Cortez organization. His hands curled into fists. I should have let him go. Should have used him to send a message back to Marco and left it at that. But you didn't. But I didn't. The admission came out rough, self-loathing, threading through every syllable. Because while I was questioning him, Marco called, taunting me, telling me that the box was just the beginning, that they had photos of you at the coffee shop you like downtown, at the art supply store on 6th Street, at your sister's apartment. They'd been watching you for weeks, cataloging your movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. Annie's blood went cold, and Damian's voice broke. I lost control. I hurt that boy worse than I needed to. Made an example of him that will haunt me for the rest of my life, because all I could see was their photos of you, their plans for you, their intention to use you as leverage against me. He looked at her with eyes that held too much pain, and I realized that being with me, having my name, wearing my ring, it doesn't make you safe. It makes you a target, the most valuable target in this city. So you're sending me away. Annie's throat felt tight. I'm setting you free. He picked up the bag again, pushed it into her hands. You never asked for this marriage. Never wanted to be part of my world. Mark trapped you. And He stopped, swallowed hard. I kept you trapped, just in a prettier cage. But that ends today. Take the money. Take the new identity. Go build the life you should have had before any of this happened. Annie looked down at the bag in her hands. $50,000. A new passport. A new name. Freedom from a marriage she'd been forced into. From a world of violence and threats and men who solved problems with blood instead of words. Everything she should want. Everything she'd thought she wanted a week ago. And what about you? She asked, looking back up at him. I'll handle the Cortez family. Once they understand you're gone, that you're no longer connected to me, they'll lose interest. You'll be safe. He said it like he believed it, like he'd convinced himself this was the right choice even though it was destroying him. And I'll go back to being what I was before. A man alone. A man who doesn't have to worry about his decisions affecting someone he stopped himself, but Annie heard the unfinished word hanging in the air between them. Someone he loved. The debt is paid, Damian repeated, his voice stronger now, more controlled. You owe me nothing. You're free to go. And I'm ordering you to go. Because if you stay... His composure cracked completely. If you stay, I'll keep you. I'll be selfish enough to keep you here in this dangerous world where men leave dead birds on my doorstep with your photo. And eventually, my luck will run out. And something will happen that I can't prevent. And I'll lose you in a way I'll never recover from. He reached out and cupped her face with both hands, his thumbs brushing away tears she hadn't realized were falling. I'd rather lose you now, when you're whole and alive and hating me for sending you away, than lose you later when I've failed to keep you safe. Do you understand? Annie understood. She understood that Damian Cepeda, the man who'd built an empire on violence and fear, the man whose very name made grown men cross themselves, was terrified. Not of his enemies or their threats or the war he'd been waging his entire adult life. He was terrified of failing her. I understand, she whispered. Relief and devastation warred across his features. He pulled her against him one last time, kissed the top of her head with a gentleness that contradicted everything else about him. Torres will drive you to the airport. I've arranged a flight to Seattle under your new name. My associate there is expecting you. He'll help you find an apartment, establish your new identity, whatever you need. You've thought of everything. I had to. He released her, stepped back, put distance between them like it physically pained him. You have an hour to gather anything you want to take. The car will be waiting. Annie nodded, clutching the duffel bag to her chest like it might anchor her to something solid. She turned toward the door, made it 3 steps before his voice stopped her. Annie. She looked back. Damian stood silhouetted against the window, backlit by morning sun, looking like a fallen angel contemplating redemption he'd never achieve. For what it's worth, these past few days with you have been the closest I've come to feeling human in 10 years. Thank you for that. The words lodged in her throat. There was so much she wanted to say, accusations and gratitude and confessions that would change everything or nothing. Instead, she said the only thing that mattered. You're welcome. Then she walked out of his office, out of his world, toward a freedom she'd stopped wanting the moment she'd seen her art hanging on his walls. The East Wing felt like a mausoleum as she packed. Annie moved mechanically, gathering the few possessions that mattered: her mother's locket, a sketchbook she'd been filling with charcoal drawings, the sundress from her first day here that still smelled faintly of jasmine from the gardens. The emerald ring sat heavy on her finger. She should take it off, should leave it on the nightstand as a final severing of ties to a marriage that had been doomed from the start. She couldn't make herself do it. An hour later, Annie stood in the front entrance with a small suitcase and the leather duffel full of money and false promises. Torres waited by the car, his face carefully neutral. Mrs. Rosa had been sent away, probably deliberately, so there would be no tearful goodbyes. Damian was nowhere to be seen. He'd said goodbye in his office, and apparently that was all she would get. The fountain angel watched her with stone eyes as Torres loaded her bags into the trunk. The morning was beautiful, clear sky, perfect temperature, birds singing in the oak trees that lined the drive. Annie took one last look at the white stucco palace, at the bell tower reaching toward heaven, at the gardens where she'd spent hours pretending she could build a life here. Then she climbed into the back seat of the Mercedes, and Torres pulled away from the only place she'd felt truly safe since Mark had destroyed her world. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she might see Damian watching from his office window. And if she saw him watching, she might do something catastrophically stupid, like stay. The gate loomed ahead. 15 feet of wrought iron roses and thorns that separated the Cepeda estate from the rest of the world. From freedom, from safety, from a life where she wouldn't wake up to dead birds and death threats and the constant awareness that loving the wrong person could get you killed. Torres slowed the Mercedes as they approached, waiting for the automatic mechanism to swing the gates open. Any second now, they would part like the Red Sea, and Annie would drive through them into whatever came next. Seattle. A new name. A new life. $50,000 in cash, and the blank canvas of anonymity stretching out before her like an invitation to start over. Everything she should want. The gates began their slow swing outward. Annie watched them open and felt absolutely nothing. No relief, no anticipation, no sense of liberation or escape. Just a hollow emptiness that grew wider with each inch the gates traveled, until it felt like the emptiness might swallow her whole. She thought about Mark, about standing at that altar in her mother's vintage lace, watching the space where he should have been standing, reading his coward's note about planes and debts, and how she was better off forgetting he existed. She'd felt humiliated then. Betrayed, publicly destroyed in front of everyone she'd ever known. But she hadn't felt empty, because even in that moment, drowning in shame and shock, she'd still felt something. Anger, grief, the burning knowledge that she'd wasted years on a man who'd valued her less than a poker habit and a mistress in Miami. This emptiness was worse. This was the feeling of walking away from something real, something true, something that terrified her and challenged her and made her feel more alive in a week than she'd felt in 7 years with Mark. The gates stood fully open now. Beyond them, the city sprawled in morning sunlight, indifferent to her choice. Millions of people living their normal lives, unaware that Annie Audrey Carmichael, or whoever she was supposed to become, was about to drive through these gates and disappear into their midst like a ghost. "Mrs. Cepeda?" Torres's voice came gently from the front seat. "Are you ready?" Mrs. Cepeda. Not her new name from the fake passport. Not Annie Carmichael, the girl who'd been abandoned at the altar. Mrs. Cepeda. The name of a woman who'd spent a week living in a palace with a man who collected her art like treasure and wore his violence like armor, and looked at her like she was the one thing in his world worth protecting. The name of a woman who'd watched that same man hurt bad people to keep good people safe. Who'd seen the tattoos that told stories of loss and loyalty. Who'd kissed him back when he'd claimed her at the altar. Who'd held him when he'd shown her his mother's face inked over his heart. Who'd told him to do what needed to be done, and then come home. Home. "Stop the car." The words came out before Annie had fully decided to say them. Torres met her eyes in the rearview mirror. "Mrs. Cepeda? Stop the car. Now." He pulled to a stop just inside the gate, the engine idling, the path to freedom still open before them. "Is something wrong?" "Everything. Nothing." Annie didn't know anymore. She looked at the duffel bag on the seat beside her, $50,000 and a new identity and a phone number that would lead her to safety. Then she looked back at the house, visible through the rear window. The white stucco palace with its bell tower and gardens and rooms full of art that Damian had bought because her work made him feel human. 7 years. He'd been supporting her for 7 years before he'd ever spoken to her. Before he'd known her name would end up on a contract that gave him the legal right to claim her. He'd bought her paintings because they moved him. Because in a life built on violence and necessary evil, her art represented something pure. And when Mark had tried to trade her like property, Damian hadn't seen an opportunity. He'd seen a woman who needed protection from a world that wanted to destroy her for crimes she hadn't committed. He'd married her, shown her his scars, trusted her with the truth of what he was. And then, when he'd decided his world was too dangerous, when he'd realized that loving him came with a target on her back, he'd let her go. Not because he didn't want her, but because he wanted her safe more than he wanted her his. That was love. Terrifying, brutal, honest love that didn't hide behind pretty words or false promises. Love that looked like a man standing in his office, destroying himself to give her freedom. Love that felt like a heavy emerald ring and 7 years of anonymous support and a kiss that tasted like ownership and devotion in equal measure. Mark had told her he loved her every day. The words had been easy, automatic, meaningless. He'd said, "I love you," while gambling away money he'd borrowed from loan sharks, while seeing a mistress in Miami, while writing a note that abandoned her to consequences he'd created. Damian had never said the words, but he'd shown her in every action, every choice, every moment since he'd walked through those cathedral doors. And now he was letting her go because he thought it was what she needed. He was wrong. Annie had a choice to make: safety or love. If you believe true love is worth fighting for, smash that like button. Don't let fear win. Let us know you're not siding with the fearmongers. "Mrs. Cepeda?" Torres's voice pulled her back. "What would you like me to do?" Annie reached for the door handle. "Turn the car around." "I'm sorry, what?" "Turn the car around. I'm not leaving." She grabbed the duffel bag, her suitcase, everything Damian had packed for her escape. "Take me back to the house." Torres turned fully in his seat, his expression carefully neutral but his eyes revealing surprise. Mr. Cepeda gave explicit instructions. "I don't care about his instructions." Annie's voice came out stronger than she'd expected. "He doesn't get to decide what's best for me. He doesn't get to send me away to protect me from his world when I'm the one who gets to choose whether his world is worth the risk." She met Torres's eyes. "Turn around. Now, or I'm walking back. And you can explain to him why you let his wife walk half a mile up a driveway in the morning heat." A smile tugged at Torres's mouth, brief, but unmistakable. Yes, Mrs. Cepeda. He executed a perfect three-point turn, and the Mercedes rolled back up the drive toward the house. Annie's heart hammered against her ribs, adrenaline and certainty flooding through her in equal measure. She was probably insane, definitely reckless, absolutely making a choice that any rational person would call self-destructive. But she'd spent 7 years with a man who'd seemed safe and turned out to be a coward. She wasn't going to spend the rest of her life wondering what would have happened if she'd been brave enough to choose the man who was honest about his darkness. The car stopped in front of the fountain. Annie didn't wait for Torres to open her door. She was already out, already moving toward the entrance, the duffel bag clutched in one hand. The heavy doors opened before she reached them. One of the household staff, a young woman whose name Annie hadn't learned yet, stood there with wide eyes. Mrs. Cepeda? I thought you'd left. Where is he? Mr. Cepeda? He's in his study, but he left orders not to be disturbed. Annie was already past her, moving through the marble foyer with purpose, her footsteps echoing off the high ceilings. Down the hallway, past the Frida Kahlo that probably cost more than most houses, to the door she'd walked through an hour ago when she'd still thought freedom meant running away. She didn't knock. Damian stood exactly where she'd left him, by the window, staring out at gardens he probably wasn't seeing. His shoulders were rigid, his hands clasped behind his back, every line of his body radiating the kind of control that came from holding yourself together by pure force of will. He turned when she entered, and the expression that crossed his face was devastating. Hope and fear and something that looked like pain all tangled together. Annie? What are you? You should be halfway to the airport by now. She crossed the room in 5 strides and threw the duffel bag at his feet. It landed with a heavy thump, $50,000 in cash hitting the hardwood like an accusation. I don't want your money. Her voice shook, but not with fear, with fury, with certainty. I don't want a new passport or a new name or a new life in Seattle where I pretend the past week didn't happen. Damian stared at her like she was a ghost. Annie, you need to leave. We discussed this. You're not safe here. I'm not safe anywhere. She cut him off, moving closer until she was standing directly in front of him. You think the Cortez family will forget about me just because I leave? You think they won't find me eventually, track me down through my art or my sister or any of 100 connections I can't sever? The only difference is whether I'm facing them with you beside me or alone in some city where I don't know anyone. I can protect you better if you're not here. If they can't use you as leverage, they can always use me as leverage. Annie reached up and grabbed his face, forcing him to look at her. Because you care about me. You've cared about me for 7 years. That doesn't stop just because I'm in a different city with a fake name. It just means you'll be distracted, wondering if I'm safe, second-guessing every decision, making mistakes because part of your attention is always on me. She held his gaze. So stop trying to protect me by sending me away, and start protecting me by teaching me how to survive in your world. Something cracked in Damian's expression. You don't know what you're asking. This life, it's violence and paranoia and always looking over your shoulder. It's knowing that any moment could be your last. It's watching people you love become targets just because they love you back. I know. Annie's thumb brushed his cheekbone. But it's also art galleries and honest conversations, and a man who's never lied to me about what he is. It's someone who sees my work and values it enough to support it for years before we ever met. It's someone who would go to war for me, who would hurt people who threaten me, who would give up his own happiness to keep me safe. Her voice dropped to a whisper. It's you, Damian, and I'm not ready to give that up. You're going to get hurt. His hands came up to cover hers. Eventually something will happen that I can't prevent, and you're going to get hurt, and it will destroy me. Maybe. Annie stepped closer, until there was no space left between them. Or maybe we'll figure it out together. Maybe I'll learn to be more careful. Maybe your enemies will realize I'm not worth the trouble. Maybe we'll have years together before anything happens. Or maybe we'll only have months. But I'd rather have months with you than years of safety somewhere else. Always wondering what would have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay. Damian searched her face like he was looking for doubt, for hesitation, for any sign that she didn't understand what she was choosing. Whatever he saw there made his eyes close, made his forehead drop to rest against hers. You're sure? His voice was raw. Once you close that gate behind you, once you commit to this, there's no going back. You'll be Annie Cepeda for real. All the danger that comes with that name, all the responsibility, all the scrutiny. Are you absolutely sure? Annie pulled back just enough to reach into her pocket. The fake passport, her escape route. Her safety net felt flimsy in her hands. She walked to the fireplace where embers still glowed from a morning fire, and without hesitation, threw the document into the flames. They both watched it catch, watched the edges curl and blacken, watched her new identity burn to ash. "I'm exactly where I belong," Annie said quietly. When she turned back, Damian was moving. He crossed the distance between them in 2 strides and pulled her against him with enough force to steal her breath. His mouth found hers, and the kiss was nothing like the claiming at the altar or the gentle press of lips at dinner. This was relief and gratitude and possession and promise all tangled together, desperate and deep and absolutely certain. Annie kissed him back with everything she had, pouring 7 years of anonymous connection and 1 week of brutal honesty and a future full of danger and devotion into the pressure of her lips against his. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Damian kept her face cradled in his hands. "You're insane," he said, but he was smiling. Actually smiling, the expression transforming his face into something younger, lighter, almost boyish. "I married a man at gunpoint after my fiancé abandoned me at the altar." Annie smiled back. "I think we established my lack of good judgment a week ago." He laughed, the first real laugh she'd heard from him, and the sound filled something in her chest she hadn't known was empty. "Mrs. Cepeda," he said, testing the name like he was tasting something precious. "You just chose a very complicated life." "Good." Annie reached up and traced the ink on his neck, the roses and thorns that warned people what he was. "I was getting bored with simple." Damian pulled her closer, tucked her head under his chin, and held her like he'd been given something he'd stopped believing he deserved. Outside the window, the gardens bloomed in morning light. The fountain angel kept watch. The gates stood closed, protection and prison both. And somewhere in the city, the Cortez family would learn that Annie Cepeda hadn't run, that she'd chosen to stay with the man who would burn their world to ash before he let them touch her, let them try. She had 7 years of art and 1 week of marriage, and a lifetime of stubborn determination that had gotten her through poverty and heartbreak and public humiliation. She could survive this too, especially with a man who looked at her like she was worth every terrible thing he'd ever done and every beautiful thing he'd ever hoped to become. "Welcome home," Damian whispered against her hair. And for the first time since Mark had put that ring on her finger in what felt like another lifetime, Annie actually believed she was.